Welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're taking a look at an episode of the true crime podcast 48 Hours called Unmasking the Zombie Hunter. It's a really interesting case from the early 90s in Phoenix, Arizona.
Yeah, a fascinating case that went cold for over 2 decades.
And we're going to kind of look at how, investigators were finally able to bring this guy to justice. So picture this. Two young women found murdered along the canals of Phoenix.
Okay.
And we're talking those picturesque canals, those places that are meant for, leisurely strolls and bike rides.
Right, and that just adds to the unsettling nature of the case.
Exactly. Suddenly, these serene locations become crime scenes. The first victim, Angela Braso, she was 22 years old. She was actually just hours away from celebrating her birthday when she vanished in November of 1992. And she was a tech worker who loved biking along those canals.
And it's a reminder that even in places that feel familiar and safe, we can still be vulnerable.
Absolutely. It's a tragic reminder to always be aware of our surroundings. Now, the second victim, Melanie Bernest, she was only 17, a high school student. And she also disappeared while riding her bike along the canal just 10 months after Angela's murder.
And her body was found not far from where Angela's had been discovered.
Right. The similarities between the two cases were impossible to ignore.
Both young women had been stabbed, and there was a clear brutality to both crimes.
And it really amplified that sense of fear in the community.
Exactly. People were on edge, knowing that someone capable of such violence was still out there.
And the DNA evidence collected at both scenes confirmed what investigators suspected. They were dealing with the same perpetrator.
But the big question remained, who was this person?
And that's where things stalled for years.
It's hard to imagine that feeling of uncertainty, the families left wondering, the community gripped by fear.
20 years without answers, a case growing colder by the day.
But thankfully, law enforcement never gave up on these cases.
Enter Detective Clark Schwarzoff and the Cold Case Squad, determined to bring closure to these unsolved murders.
And they were aided by advancements in DNA technology.
Right, think about all the leaps and bounds that have happened in forensic science, particularly in DNA analysis. And that's where forensic genealogy comes in a revolutionary approach to solving cold cases.
It's amazing how they can trace family trees through DNA now.
It's like something out of a science fiction movie.
It's incredible. And investigators use this technology to search public genealogy databases, looking for any familial matches to the DNA from the crime scenes.
And that search led them straight to a name, Brian Patrick Miller. But get this, Brian Patrick Miller was a local figure known by many as the Zombie Hunter.
It's almost too strange to be true.
It really is like something you'd see in a movie, this seemingly harmless local character with this dark secret.
It really makes you question how well we can ever truly know someone.
Absolutely. This guy was known for dressing up in elaborate costumes, driving a tricked-out car covered in fake blood. He was a fixture at local parades and festivals, even posing for pictures with police officers.
And that contrast between his public persona and the horrific crimes he was accused of, that's what makes this case so intriguing.
It's a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving.
Right, it raises questions about how we construct our identities.
But before we could really dive into the why the police needed to confirm that Miller was their guy, they needed his DNA.
And they came up with a pretty ingenious way to get it.
Oh yeah, tell me about this.
So Detective Schwarzoff, thinking outside the box, posed as a security consultant
Oh, wow.
and offered Miller a fake job.
Like an undercover operation.
Exactly. He even met Miller at a Chili's restaurant to fill out a job application.
That's dedication.
It really shows how determined they were to solve this case. And during that meeting, Miller unknowingly provided the evidence they needed.
By like leaving fingerprints or something?
Even simpler than that, he used a water glass,
Oh.
which they were able to collect and test for DNA.
So they were just waiting for those lab results, knowing they held the key to cracking this case.
The anticipation must have been incredible.
And when those results came back, it was a match. Brian Patrick Miller, the zombie hunter, was definitively linked to the murders of Angela Braso and Melanie Bernest.
It's a moment that sends chills down your spine. This seemingly harmless, even goofy local character, now a prime suspect in a double homicide.
So the case after 2 decades had finally come alive.
But to truly understand the gravity of these crimes, we need to look beyond the sensational headlines and delve into Brian Patrick Miller's past.
And trust me, it's a troubled one.
We're about to uncover a lot more about the path that led him to this dark place.
So stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into the mind of a killer. We'll be right back.
We're back and ready to dig deeper into the trial of Brian Patrick Miller, the zombie hunter. Now, his defense team took a really interesting approach. They actually admitted that he was the one who killed Angela and Melanie.
Yeah, it's a bold strategy. Right. They weren't trying to argue that he didn't do it. Instead, they were going for an insanity defense.
They were basically saying he wasn't in control of his actions.
Like he wasn't responsible for what he did.
Exactly. And to support that, they focused heavily on Miller's troubled childhood,
Painting him as a victim of severe abuse and trauma.
particularly at the hands of his mother, Ellen.
So they were really trying to establish a connection between his past and his violent behavior.
Right. The defense argued that Ellen was incredibly abusive, both physically and psychologically.
It's hard to imagine the kind of environment he grew up in.
Yeah, they claim she exposed him to all sorts of disturbing things, creating this really unstable and frightening atmosphere for him as a child.
And it makes you think, how much can we attribute a person's actions to their upbringing?
It's a really complex question and one that the courts often have to grapple with.
Right. And in this case, Miller's defense was hoping to convince the judge that his past trauma essentially made him incapable of controlling his impulses.
And they brought up this psychological condition called dissociative amnesia.
I've heard of that. Isn't that like when someone blocks out certain memories?
Exactly. It's the inability to recall specific events, often those that are traumatic.
So they were suggesting that Miller had no memory of committing the murders?
Right. They were presenting this idea that he had a split personality.
Like a Jekyll and Hyde kind of thing?
Yeah, on one hand, you have the good Brian, the guy who dressed up as a zombie hunter, the father, the friend.
Right. But then lurking beneath that facade was this bad Brian, capable of these horrific acts of violence.
And they argued that this bad Brian took over during the murders, leaving the good Brian with no recollection of what happened.
It's a compelling narrative, but did the prosecution buy it?
Not really. They argued that Miller's memory was selective and convenient.
What do you mean by that?
Well, he could remember details about other stabbings he'd committed.
Like the attack on Celeste Bentley when he was just 16.
Exactly, and the incident with Melissa Ruiz Ramirez in Washington State.
But he couldn't remember the Canal murders.
Right. The prosecution pointed out that if he truly had amnesia, it wouldn't be so selective.
It seems like a pretty big hole in the defense's argument.
It definitely weakened their case.
And to further challenge the defense's portrayal of Miller, the prosecution called a key witness to the stand, his ex-wife, Amy.
Her testimony was incredibly powerful and shed light on a much darker side of Brian Patrick Miller.
From what I understand, Amy described how he became increasingly violent and controlling during their marriage.
Especially after he was released from jail in Washington.
It seems like a very different picture than the one the defense was trying to paint.
Absolutely. Amy's account directly contradicted the idea of this harmless good Brian.
So what specific things did she talk about?
Well, she recounted instances of forced bondage, the use of needles, and even times when he held a knife to her throat during sex.
That's terrifying.
It was a really disturbing escalation of behavior that showed a clear pattern of violence and a need for control.
It's hard to reconcile that with the image of the fun-loving zombie hunter.
Right, it really makes you question how much of who we are is a performance and how much is truly hidden beneath the surface.
So back to the trial, you had this clash of narratives playing out. The defense arguing insanity, the prosecution arguing that Miller was a calculated and violent individual fully aware of his actions.
And remember, this was a bench trial, meaning there was no jury.
So it was all up to Judge Suzanne Cohen to decide Miller's fate.
Exactly. She had to weigh all the evidence, the testimony, the arguments from both sides.
What an incredible responsibility.
Absolutely. The weight of those two young women's lives rested on her shoulders.
And after months of testimony, Judge Cohen finally reached a verdict.
Guilty on both counts of first-degree murder.
Wow, what a moment that must have been, the culmination of years of investigation and a long fight for justice.
It was a victory for the prosecution, but it was also a bittersweet victory for the families of the victims.
I can't even imagine the mix of emotions they must have felt.
Relief, closure, but also the realization that nothing could truly erase the pain of their loss.
And during the sentencing phase, Angela's mother and Melanie's sister delivered incredibly moving impact statements.
Yeah, they talked about their unfathomable grief, the emptiness left by the murders, and the long, agonizing wait for justice.
It must have been heartbreaking to hear their words.
It really puts into perspective the human cost of these crimes.
So what about Miller himself? Did he express any remorse or take responsibility for his actions?
He did offer a statement before sentencing.
Yeah.
He acknowledged the pain he had caused the families and even mentioned the abuse he suffered at the hands of his mother as a contributing factor to his actions.
But did he actually admit to killing Angela and Melanie?
He stopped short of a full confession.
So even at that point, he wasn't fully taking ownership of what he had done.
It left many wondering if he truly grasped the gravity of his crimes.
So then came the judge's final decision, life in prison or the death penalty.
It's the heaviest choice a judge can make.
And in this case, Judge Cohen decided that the death penalty was warranted.
She recognized the horrific nature of the murders and the lasting impact on the victims' families.
So Brian Patrick Miller, the zombie hunter, was sentenced to death for his crimes.
It seemed like the case was finally closed. Justice had been served.
But as we'll see, there's another layer to this story, a lingering question that casts a shadow over everything we've uncovered so far, the disappearance of Brandy Myers. We've spent this deep dive uncovering the truth behind the zombie hunter mask, exploring the chilling details of the Canal murders, and seeing how justice was eventually served.
Yeah, it's been a long and winding road to get to this point.
But there's still this one big question mark hanging over the entire case.
The disappearance of Brandy Myers.
This 13-year-old girl who vanished from her neighborhood just a few doors down from where Miller was living.
And the timing of it all is what's truly unsettling.
Right, it's like a chilling echo of the Canal murders. Brandy disappeared just months before Angela and Melanie were killed.
Right, as Miller was transitioning out of juvenile detention after the attack on Celeste Bentley.
It's hard to ignore that correlation.
If you look at Miller's pattern of behavior, Brandy's disappearance fits right in.
Like a missing piece of a very dark puzzle.
And then you have the account from Miller's ex-wife, Amy.
Her claim that Miller confessed to killing a young girl.
Yeah, it's a detail that stuck with me throughout this whole case.
Not just the confession itself, but the way Amy described how he allegedly dismembered and disposed of the body.
Those details are horrifying, but they do align with what we know about the Canal murders.
That same brutality, that same calculated approach.
While Amy couldn't confirm the victim's name, it's hard not to connect her account with Brandy's disappearance.
It feels like everything points to Miller's involvement.
But without physical evidence, without a body, it remains speculation.
And that's what makes Brandy's case so heartbreaking. The lack of closure, the unanswered questions.
It's a reminder that even when justice is served, some wounds never fully heal.
As we wrap up our deep dive into the zombie hunter case, I keep coming back to that question of identity.
Can we really separate the persona from the man?
The zombie hunter from the convicted murderer.
It's a question that goes beyond this particular case.
It makes you think about the masks we all wear, the ways we present ourselves to the world.
And what might be lurking beneath the surface.
In Miller's case, was the zombie hunter an outlet for his darkness?
A way to foreshadow the horrors to come.
Or was it a desperate attempt to cling to some semblance of normalcy, to hide the monster within?
It's a chilling thought.
It's a reminder that true crime isn't just about solving puzzles or catching the bad guy. It's about confronting the darkest aspects of human nature.
And trying to understand the complexities that lead someone down such a destructive path.
This case, with all its twists and turns, also underscores the impact of trauma.
And the need for mental health awareness.
If Miller's accounts of abuse are true, it paints a stark picture of how early experiences can shape a person's trajectory.
It makes you think about the ripple effects of abuse.
How it can impact not only the individual, but also the community around them.
And it highlights the importance of breaking the cycle of violence.
Providing support for those who are struggling.
And creating a culture where it's safe to seek help.
Absolutely. But amidst all the darkness, there's also a glimmer of hope in this story.
The resilience of the human spirit.
The families of Angela and Melanie never gave up their fight for justice.
They endured decades of pain and uncertainty.
But their perseverance ultimately prevailed.
It's a testament to the power of love.
And the unwavering belief that truth will eventually surface.
And while Brandy Myers' case remains open, the search for answers continues.
Perhaps one day advancements in forensic science will shed light on her fate.
And bring closure to those who loved her.
We can only hope. This deep dive into the zombie hunter has been a journey into the shadows of humanity.
But it's a story that demands to be told.
It's a story about the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface.
The complexities of human behavior.
And the enduring pursuit of justice.
For all of you listening out there, I hope you'll carry with you some of the insights we've uncovered today.
Think about the masks people wear, the unseen struggles they might be facing.
And the power we each have to create a more compassionate and understanding world.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.